Willow Creek was one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods you see in magazines. You know the kind I'm talking about. Every lawn trimmed to exactly the same height, every mailbox painted in matching colors, every driveway swept clean. It was the sort of place where everything had its place, and everyone followed the rules. The Homeowners Association, or the HOA as folks called it, made absolutely sure of that. Now, 3 years before our story really gets going, a man named John Harper moved to Willow Creek with his 12-year-old daughter, Lily. John was the kind of man you'd notice, but might not remember right away. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet strength of someone who'd seen his share of hard times. But he wasn't one for small talk or neighborhood gossip. He kept to himself mostly, nodding politely when he passed by, but never stopping to chat about the weather or the local news. What most folks in Willow Creek didn't know, what John made sure they didn't know, was that he worked as the county sheriff. That's right, the man living quietly at the end of Elm Street was actually the top law enforcement officer in the entire county. But John had his reasons for keeping that information private. After his wife passed away a few years back, leaving him to raise Lily on his own, he'd made a decision. He wanted a safe, peaceful place where his daughter could just be a kid, without everyone treating them differently because of his badge or feeling sorry for them because of their loss. Lily Harper was something special, that little girl. She'd been born with a medical condition that affected her legs and her ability to walk. By the time she was 12, she'd been using a wheelchair for most of her life. But if you spent even 5 minutes with Lily, you'd forget all about that wheelchair. She had the biggest, brightest smile you ever saw, the kind that could light up a whole room. She loved sitting on their front porch, watching the birds fly by, the neighbors walking their dogs, and the kids riding their bikes up and down the street. She had this way of finding joy in the smallest things. A butterfly landing on a flower, the mailman waving hello, the way the afternoon sun made patterns through the tree leaves. The Harpers lived in a modest little house at the very end of Elm Street, tucked away where the neighborhood started to get quiet. The first thing John did after they moved in was build a wooden ramp leading up to their front door. He spent a whole weekend measuring, sawing, and hammering, making sure every board was secure and the slope was gentle enough for Lily to wheel herself up and down safely. He painted it a nice shade of brown that matched the house, and when he was done, he stood back and smiled, knowing his little girl would have her independence. Most of the neighbors seemed like decent people. They'd wave from their yards, bring over a casserole now and then, and ask how Lily was doing. But there was one neighbor who didn't share that friendly spirit. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and from the very first day the Harpers arrived, she made it clear she wasn't happy about them being there. Karen ran the Homeowners Association like it was her personal kingdom. She was the kind of person who always seemed to be looking for something wrong, something out of place, some tiny rule that someone had broken. She had a loud voice that carried across yards, and she wasn't shy about using it. Some folks thought she was just particular about keeping the neighborhood nice. Others knew better. Karen liked the power, the control, the feeling that everyone had to listen to her. The moment she laid eyes on that wheelchair ramp John had built, Karen's face twisted into a frown. John saw her standing at the edge of his property line that first day, clipboard in hand, lips pressed together in disapproval. He heard her mutter something about ruining the neighborhood aesthetic and property values. But John didn't engage. He just nodded politely and went back inside with Lily. He'd dealt with difficult people before in his line of work. He figured if he just kept his head down and followed the rules, Karen would eventually leave them alone. Looking back now, he wishes he'd known then just how wrong he was about that. The air in Willow Creek had a strange quality to it sometimes. On those warm summer evenings when everything should have felt peaceful and relaxed, there was this heaviness, this tension hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. John noticed it, felt it in his bones. He remembered that first rainy afternoon when they moved in, carrying Lily in his arms while the movers brought in their boxes. He'd looked around at the neat houses and trimmed lawns and thought, this is it. This is where we can start over, where Lily can be safe and happy. But before he even had their furniture arranged, he heard that sharp voice cutting through the sound of rain on pavement. Karen, complaining loudly about their moving truck blocking the street, about how long they were taking, about how this was causing problems for everyone. John had ignored her that day, assuming she was just having a bad day, that once they were settled in, things would smooth out. He couldn't have been more wrong. Karen's eyes were always on them, always watching, always waiting. And the trouble that was brewing? Well, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Karen Mitchell didn't believe in giving people a grace period. She didn't waste any time before she started making life difficult for John Harper and his daughter. It all began with that wheelchair ramp, the one John had so carefully built to give Lily her independence. On a crisp morning about a week after they'd moved in, John was outside doing some maintenance on the ramp, tightening a few bolts, making sure everything was stable. He had his toolbox open on the ground, his hands covered in grease from the work. That's when he heard the sharp click of heels on the sidewalk. He looked up to see Karen marching toward him like a soldier going into battle, that ever-present clipboard clutched in her hands. "This ramp is unapproved," she announced, her voice loud enough that several neighbors peeked out their windows. She pointed at the ramp like it was some kind of eyesore. "It's ugly, and it clearly breaks HOA regulations. You can't just build whatever you want without submitting the proper paperwork and getting approval from the board." John slowly stood up, wiping his hands on an old rag. He looked at Karen calmly, keeping his voice steady and quiet. "It's for Lily," he explained. "She needs it to get in and out of the house safely. It's not decorative, it's medical equipment." Karen just scribbled something on her clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She didn't even look at him as she turned on her heel and walked away. John stood there for a moment, watching her go, hoping that would be the end of it. He told himself she was just doing her job, being thorough, making sure everything was by the book. But it wasn't the end, not even close. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Karen found more and more things to complain about. Lily had physical therapy equipment, special braces, support devices, a padded exercise mat that John kept in their garage. One day, he'd left the garage door open while he helped Lily with her exercises. Karen happened to walk by, and apparently, that was all she needed. A few days later, John found a fine in his mailbox. The letter, written in Karen's neat handwriting on official HOA letterhead, called Lily's medical equipment unsightly clutter that was damaging the neighborhood's appearance. The fine was $75. John paid it. He didn't want trouble. He just closed the garage door from then on, even though it made the space hot and stuffy during Lily's therapy sessions. Then Karen started complaining about the marks Lily's wheelchair left on the sidewalk. Now, these weren't big marks, just faint scuff marks from the rubber wheels, the kind that would wash away with the next good rain. But to hear Karen tell it, you'd think Lily was vandalizing public property. "This is destruction of neighborhood infrastructure," she shouted one afternoon, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, waving her arms like she was directing traffic. John was just trying to push Lily home from a walk, and Karen had practically jumped out in front of them. Another time, Lily was sitting on their front porch on a beautiful sunny day, humming softly to herself. She wasn't being loud, just a quiet, happy sound, the way kids do when they're content. Karen stormed up their walkway like she'd been personally offended. "That noise is too much," she snapped. "Keep it down. Some of us are trying to enjoy the peace and quiet of our neighborhood." Every single time Karen came at them with a new complaint, John stayed calm. He'd take a deep breath, count to 5 in his head, and respond as politely as he could manage. "It's for Lily," he'd say, or, "Come on, Karen, let it go." He paid the fines when they came. He fixed whatever she demanded. He moved things around, adjusted their routine, did everything he could to comply. But inside, deep down where nobody could see, his patience was starting to wear thin. It was like trying to hold back a dam with his bare hands, and the cracks were beginning to show. The neighbors saw what was happening. Mrs. Carter, the sweet elderly lady who lived in the house next door, would peek through her curtains and shake her head sadly. "That poor child doesn't deserve this kind of treatment," she'd whisper to herself, her heart breaking for little Lily. She genuinely liked the Harpers. John was respectful and helpful, always offering to carry her groceries or check on her during bad weather. And Lily? Well, Lily was an absolute angel. But Mrs. Carter was also terrified of Karen's temper. She'd seen Karen reduce grown men to stammering apologies over a misplaced garden gnome. So she stayed quiet, offering her support in small, private ways. The children who lived on Elm Street used to love playing with Lily. They'd run over after school asking if she could come out. They'd push her wheelchair along the sidewalk, letting her join in their games of catch. They'd toss her a ball, and she'd throw it back with surprising accuracy, laughing the whole time. But once Karen started her campaign against the Harpers, those kids scattered like leaves in the wind whenever she appeared. Their parents, not wanting their families to become Karen's next target, had quietly warned them to keep their distance. Before long, the street got quieter. The laughter faded. The Harpers found themselves more and more isolated. Lily started noticing the change. Kids are perceptive that way. They pick up on things adults think they're hiding. One evening, as John was pushing her wheelchair up the ramp and into the house after a particularly difficult day, she looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. Her voice came out small and uncertain. "Why does she hate us, Dad?" Those 5 words hit John harder than any punch he'd ever taken. His heart just sank right down into his boots. He knelt beside her wheelchair, right there in the doorway, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face. He wanted to tell her the truth, that some people are just mean, that some people take their own unhappiness out on others, that the world isn't always fair. But she was 12 years old, and she'd already dealt with more challenges than most adults face in a lifetime. "She doesn't hate you, sweetheart," he said softly, even though the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. "Some people just don't understand. They don't know how to act around someone different from them. But you're not different in a bad way. You're special. You're perfect exactly the way you are, and I wouldn't change a single thing about you." Lily nodded. But her smile, that beautiful bright smile that usually lit up his whole world, wasn't quite as wide as it normally was. John pulled her into a tight hug, holding her close, feeling that protective fire inside him growing stronger and hotter. He didn't want his daughter to feel this way. She shouldn't have to question why someone disliked her when she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair. But Karen wasn't stopping. If anything, her harassment was getting worse, more focused, more personal. She started walking past their house more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, always slowing down to stare when Lily was sitting outside. Once, John overheard her talking to another neighbor, her voice dripping with disdain. "They get special treatment because of that wheelchair," she was saying. "It's not fair to the rest of us who actually follow the rules. They think they're above the HOA guidelines." John, standing just inside his front door, where he could hear every word, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. But he forced himself to stay quiet. He didn't want trouble. Not yet, anyway. See, people in the neighborhood knew him as just a dad, just a regular guy trying to raise his daughter. They had no idea he was the county sheriff, that he spent his days dealing with criminals and dangerous situations. Here he was just John Harper from the end of Elm Street, and he wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. Still, every snide comment from Karen, every cold stare she directed at his little girl, every petty, fine, and ridiculous complaint pushed him closer to his breaking point. He could feel it coming, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The whole neighborhood felt it, too. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Carter, bless her heart, left a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies on the Harpers' porch one evening, still warm from the oven. It was her quiet way of saying, "I care about you and I'm sorry for what you're going through." But she wouldn't speak up publicly, wouldn't defend them at HOA meetings, wouldn't risk putting herself in Karen's crosshairs. The other kids stopped coming around altogether. Where once there had been the sound of children laughing and playing, now there was just silence. Karen's shadow hung over Elm Street like a dark cloud, and her picky, nitpicky rules had transformed into something much meaner, much more sinister. This wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards anymore. This was personal. This was targeted. This was about one thing and one thing only. Karen wanted the Harpers gone. John could see it in her eyes every time they crossed paths. That cold, hard look that said she wouldn't be satisfied until they packed up and left Willow Creek forever. She looked at Lily like the child was a problem that needed to be solved, an inconvenience that needed to be removed. The trouble that had been simmering beneath the surface all this time. It was about to boil over in the worst possible way. And when it did, everything in Willow Creek was going to change forever. It was one of those perfect summer days that make you remember why you love the season. The sky was a brilliant blue without a cloud in sight, and the temperature was warm but not too hot. In Willow Creek, that meant the community pool was packed with families. Kids were splashing and diving, their laughter echoing across the water. Parents sat in lounge chairs, chatting and sipping cold drinks. It was the kind of day where everyone just wanted to relax and enjoy themselves. Lily loved going to the pool, even though her medical condition meant she couldn't actually swim. Her legs were too weak to kick properly, and her lungs couldn't handle being in the water. It was just too dangerous. But that didn't dampen her spirits one bit. She was perfectly content to sit in her wheelchair near the shallow end, watching all the activity with that gorgeous smile on her face, soaking up the sunshine and the happy atmosphere. John sat nearby on a wooden bench, keeping a watchful eye on his daughter like he always did. He had a cold lemonade in one hand, and for a little while, everything felt peaceful. He could see Lily pointing at kids doing cannonballs, giggling when the water splashed high. This was what he'd wanted when they moved to Willow Creek. Normal, happy moments where Lily could just be a kid enjoying her childhood. Then Karen Mitchell showed up, and the whole day changed in an instant. Karen came marching into the pool area like she owned the place, her face already red with anger before she'd even spotted what was bothering her. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and then they locked onto Lily's wheelchair. Something in her expression shifted, hardened, and she started storming directly toward them. "This is not a handicapped zone," she yelled, her voice cutting through all the happy sounds of the pool. She was pointing at Lily's wheelchair like it was some kind of offensive object. "That thing doesn't belong here!" Now, Lily's wheelchair wasn't blocking anything. There was plenty of room for people to walk around it. She wasn't in anyone's way. But that didn't matter to Karen. Nothing mattered to Karen except her need to control everything and everyone. John immediately stood up, setting his drink down carefully. He kept his voice firm but quiet, trying not to make a scene in front of all these families. "She's not in anyone's way, Karen. Just back off and leave us alone." But Karen had never listened to reason before, and she wasn't about to start now. Her eyes got narrow and mean, and she stepped closer to Lily. Her hands were actually shaking. Whether from rage or something else, John couldn't tell. He moved to step between them to protect his daughter, but everything happened so fast. Before John could react, before anyone could stop her, Karen grabbed the handles of Lily's wheelchair with both hands. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson," she shouted, her voice filled with venom, and then she pushed, hard. The wheelchair rolled fast toward the edge of the pool. Lily's eyes went wide with terror. She let out a scream, a sound John would hear in his nightmares for years to come, as the wheelchair tipped over the edge and she fell into the deep end with a huge splash. For a split second, the entire pool area went completely silent. Everyone froze, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Then gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. The wheelchair sank quickly. the weight of the metal frame pulling it down to the bottom of the pool. But worse, so much worse, was Lily. She was flailing in the deep end, her arms slapping at the water, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled. She couldn't swim. Her body wouldn't let her kick, wouldn't let her tread water. She was drowning, right there in front of everyone. John didn't think. There was no time for thinking. His body moved on pure instinct and adrenaline. He dropped his lemonade, which hit the concrete and shattered, and dove into the pool fully clothed. His boots, his jeans, his shirt, none of it mattered. The water was shockingly cold after the hot sun, but he barely noticed. He was a strong swimmer, and he cut through the water like an arrow, reaching Lily in what felt like seconds but was probably longer. He wrapped his arms around her small body, just as she was starting to go under. She was coughing, gasping, crying, her little face contorted in fear. Water streamed from her hair and down her face. Her whole body was shaking violently, partly from the cold, partly from the shock, partly from the sheer terror of nearly drowning. "I've got you, baby girl. I've got you," John kept saying as he pulled her to the shallow end where he could stand. He held her tight against his chest, supporting her completely, letting her cling to him as hard as she needed to. He climbed out of the pool, water streaming from his soaked clothes, his boots squishing with every step. Lily was pressed against his chest, her arms wrapped around his neck in a death grip, her whole body trembling. He could feel her heart racing against his ribs. She was coughing up pool water, and each cough made his heart break a little more. And there, standing exactly where she'd been when she pushed the wheelchair, was Karen. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and she actually had the audacity, the absolute nerve, to have a little smirk on her face. "She's fine," Karen said, rolling her eyes like the whole thing was no big deal. "Stop being so dramatic and overreacting about everything." The crowd of neighbors and families was staring now. Some had their phones out, recording everything. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few kids were crying, upset by what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Carter had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. John gently set Lily down on the concrete, making absolutely sure she could breathe properly, checking her over for any injuries. His hands were shaking as he brushed wet hair from her face. Then he stood up, water dripping from every part of him, forming a puddle around his boots. He reached down and grabbed his wet jacket, peeling it off his shoulders. And there, pinned to his shirt and gleaming in the bright sunlight, was his county sheriff's badge. The murmuring in the crowd got louder. People started whispering urgently to each other. Some pointed at the badge, suddenly putting two and two together about who their quiet neighbor really was. John's voice, when he spoke, was low and hard as steel. Every word came out controlled, measured, but filled with barely contained fury. "You just assaulted my daughter. I'm the county sheriff, and you're under arrest." Karen's smirk disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. The crowd's whispers turned into louder conversations. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of Karen's downfall. People who'd been bullied by her for years watched with something like satisfaction on their faces. Karen took a stumbling step backward, her hands starting to tremble, but this time it was from fear, not anger. She'd finally gone too far, done something she couldn't talk her way out of or brush off as maintaining neighborhood standards. The trouble had found her at last, and there was no escape. Not this time. Not ever again. Lily was shaking like a leaf in the wind, her small body cold and soaking wet from the pool. She clung to John with every ounce of strength she had, her little arms wrapped so tight around his neck that he could barely breathe. But he didn't care. Her breathing came in quick, scared gasps, and she couldn't seem to stop trembling. Water dripped from her hair onto his already soaked shirt, creating a growing puddle at their feet. John grabbed a large beach towel from a nearby chair. He didn't even know whose it was, and it didn't matter, and wrapped it completely around Lily, cocooning her in it. He pulled her as close as physically possible, tucking her head under his chin. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You're safe. Daddy's here, and nothing bad is going to happen to you," he whispered directly into her ear, his voice as soft and steady as he could make it despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. Lily buried her face in his chest, still coughing a little, trying to get the last of the pool water out of her lungs. Her wheelchair was somewhere at the bottom of the deep end, completely submerged and probably ruined. But John didn't care about that right now. Material things could be replaced. His daughter couldn't. A few feet away, Karen was stammering, trying to form words, trying to find some way to talk herself out of this situation like she'd done so many times before. I didn't mean it," she said, her voice shaky and uncertain now, nothing like her usual commanding tone. It was an accident. She's fine, look at her, she's perfectly fine." But the neighbors weren't buying it. Not for 1 second. The people in the crowd were muttering angrily now, and the mood had completely shifted. Some were still holding up their phones, making sure to capture every moment for evidence. A man somewhere in the back of the crowd shouted out, "You pushed her in? We all saw it. That was no accident." A woman added, "How could you do that to a child? What's wrong with you?" Karen's eyes darted around frantically, searching for someone, anyone, who might take her side, who might support her story. But there was nobody. She was completely alone, and the reality of what she'd done was starting to sink in. John ignored her excuses completely. He pulled out his cell phone with one hand while keeping the other arm securely around Lily. He hit a number on speed dial, and when someone answered, his tone was sharp and professional. This was Sheriff Harper now, not just a worried dad. "This is Sheriff Harper. I need backup at the Willow Creek community pool immediately. I have a suspect in custody for assault on a minor." He ended the call and carefully set Lily down on the bench, making sure the towel stayed wrapped around her, keeping her warm. She was still shivering, but not quite as violently now. He knelt down in front of her, looking directly into her eyes. "I need you to stay right here for just a minute, okay? I'm not going anywhere. I'll be right over there where you can see me. Can you do that for me?" Lily nodded, her eyes still wide with fear, but she trusted her father completely. She pulled the towel tighter around herself and watched as John stood up and turned to face Karen. He walked toward her with measured, deliberate steps. His sheriff's badge was still visible on his shirt, water-damaged, but unmistakable. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his handcuffs, something he never thought he'd need to bring to a community pool on a Saturday afternoon. Karen took a step backward, then another. "This is ridiculous!" she sputtered, trying to regain some of her usual authoritative bluster. "You can't arrest me! I'm the president of the HOA! I was just trying to maintain order!" "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," John said, his voice cold and completely devoid of emotion. "I will not. This is absolutely—" "Ma'am, you can cooperate, or I can add resisting arrest to the charges. Your choice." Something in his tone must have finally gotten through to her because Karen slowly turned around, her hands shaking as she put them behind her back. John secured the handcuffs around her wrists, making sure they were tight but not painful. And then he did something that, in all his years as a law enforcement officer, gave him no pleasure but was absolutely necessary. He read her rights, right there in front of the entire community pool crowd. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Each word came out like ice, formal and official. This wasn't personal revenge. This was justice, pure and simple. Karen squirmed, still trying to maintain her dignity, even with handcuffs around her wrists. "This is absolutely ridiculous. I'll sue you. I'll have your badge. You can't treat me like this." But nobody in the crowd seemed to feel sorry for her. If anything, there were quiet murmurs of approval, soft clapping from some of the neighbors who'd suffered under her tyrannical rule for years. Within minutes, 2 of John's deputies arrived in their patrol car, lights flashing but no siren. They didn't want to traumatize the kids at the pool any more than they'd already been traumatized. The deputies, both young men John had trained himself, took in the scene quickly, their sheriff soaking wet, a child wrapped in a towel, and Karen Mitchell in handcuffs. "Sheriff," one of them said questioningly. "Take her in," John said simply. "Book her for felony assault on a minor. I'll be by the station later to file the full report and provide evidence." The deputies nodded and took Karen by the arms, leading her toward their patrol car. She kept trying to protest, kept trying to argue, but they weren't listening. As they put her in the back of the car, some of the neighbors actually clapped, not loudly, not making a scene, but enough to show their support for John and their satisfaction that Karen was finally facing consequences for her actions. John immediately turned his attention back to Lily, ignoring everything else. That was where his heart was, where his focus needed to be. He walked back to the bench and scooped her up in his arms, despite the fact that she was 12 years old and getting bigger. Right now, she needed to feel safe, needed to feel protected, and if that meant carrying her like a little child, then that's exactly what he was going to do. He carried her away from the pool, his boots squishing with every step, leaving wet footprints on the hot concrete. The crowd parted respectfully, letting them through. Some people reached out to gently pat Lily's shoulder or squeeze John's arm, offering silent support and sympathy. In John's head, as he carried his daughter home, he made a solemn promise to himself and to her. This nightmare with Karen Mitchell was going to end, once and for all. He would make absolutely sure of it. She would face every legal consequence available, and she would never, ever be in a position to hurt his daughter or anyone else's children again. When they got home, he set Lily down gently on the living room couch, the same couch where they watched movies together and where she did her homework. He wrapped her in a second blanket, one of the soft fleece ones she loved, this one decorated with stars, because she was still shivering a little. Her wet clothes were making her cold, so he helped her change into warm, dry pajamas, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. There was a knock at the front door. John opened it to find Mrs. Carter standing there, her elderly hands shaking as she held a small tray with 2 steaming mugs of hot tea. Her eyes were red and wet with tears, and her voice cracked when she spoke. "I saw the whole thing," she said, barely above a whisper. "I saw what that horrible woman did. You're a good man, John Harper, a good father. And that little angel in there," she nodded toward Lily. "She's the bravest girl I've ever known." She set the tray down on the small table by the door and reached out to gently pat Lily's hand. Lily managed a small smile for her, which made Mrs. Carter's tears flow even more freely. John's throat was tight with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say. "That means more than you know." Mrs. Carter gave him a watery smile, pride shining in her old eyes, then quietly left them alone. John sat down on the couch next to Lily, pulling her close against his side. He picked up one of the mugs of tea and took a careful sip, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The weight of the day was crushing down on him. The terror of seeing Lily fall into the pool, the rage at Karen's actions, the stress of having to arrest someone in front of the entire neighborhood. But here, in this quiet moment with his daughter safe beside him, he could finally start to process it all. Justice had started today, but he wouldn't rest, couldn't rest, until it was completely finished. Karen Mitchell was going to pay for what she'd done, and the law would make sure of it. About a week after the pool incident, tensions in Willow Creek were running higher than they'd ever been before. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about what had happened. About Karen pushing Lily into the pool, about John being the county sheriff, about the arrest. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone wanted to talk about it. The HOA called an emergency meeting, and when they did, nobody wanted to miss it. The meeting was held in the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse, a large room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly overhead. On this particular evening, the room was absolutely packed. People filled every available seat, and others stood along the walls. There was an electric feeling in the air. Anticipation, mixed with anxiety, mixed with anger. And sitting right in the front row, as bold as you please, was Karen Mitchell. She was out on bail, which had apparently been posted by some relative from out of town. She sat there with her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her chin tilted up in that familiar defiant way. When the meeting was called to order and she was given a chance to speak, she stood up and addressed the crowd. "This has all been blown completely out of proportion," she announced, her voice trying to sound confident but coming across as slightly desperate. "It was a misunderstanding, an accident. People are making it into something much bigger than it actually is. I've served this community faithfully for years, and this is how I'm being treated?" But her voice wasn't as strong as it used to be. There was a tremor in it, a weakness that people hadn't heard before. The woman who had ruled the HOA like her personal fiefdom was starting to crack. Then the side door of the clubhouse opened and John Harper walked in. But he didn't walk in as the quiet neighbor from Elm Street, the single dad who kept to himself. He walked in wearing his full sheriff's uniform, the pressed dark shirt, the badge gleaming prominently on his chest, his duty belt with all its equipment, his hat tucked professionally under one arm. He looked every inch the law enforcement officer he was, and his presence commanded immediate attention. People turned to stare. Those who hadn't quite believed the rumors about him being the county sheriff now had their proof right in front of them. John took a position at the front of the room, and the entire atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just another neighborhood dispute anymore. This was serious. This was official. He carried with him a thick manila folder and a USB drive. The three members of the HOA board, all of whom had worked under Karen's domineering leadership for years, sat at a table at the front, looking nervous and uncomfortable. They avoided making eye contact with either John or Karen. John stepped up to address the assembled neighbors. His voice was strong, clear, and professional. "I've brought evidence," he said simply. He walked to a laptop that had been set up for the meeting and plugged in his USB drive. "I think everyone here deserves to see exactly what happened at the pool last week, so there's no confusion, no he said, she said, no room for misinterpretation." The lights in the clubhouse dimmed slightly as he started playing videos from the pool. Multiple phones had captured the incident from different angles, and John had collected all the footage as evidence. The room fell completely silent as they watched Karen grab the wheelchair handles and shove it toward the water. They heard her voice, captured clearly on the recordings. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson." Gasps filled the room. Some people covered their mouths in shock. They watched as Lily fell into the deep end, and John dove in to save her. The reality of what could have happened, what nearly did happen, hit everyone hard. John then pulled out papers from his folder, months of complaints and fines Karen had issued against the Harpers. He held them up for everyone to see. "This wasn't an isolated incident," he explained. "She's been targeting my daughter for months simply because Lily uses a wheelchair." Mrs. Carter suddenly stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "She's terrorized this whole neighborhood for years. I was too scared to speak up before, but not anymore." Others joined in, sharing their own stories of Karen's bullying and harassment. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They'd enabled Karen's behavior, let her run unchecked for too long. Now they had no choice but to act. "Karen Mitchell is removed from the HOA board, effective immediately," the head board member announced quietly. Karen slumped in her chair, defeated and humiliated. Karen's legal troubles moved swiftly. She was convicted of felony assault on a minor and reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay substantial fines, money that went toward Lily's medical care and therapy after the traumatic incident. As county sheriff, John oversaw her booking at the station. He remained professional throughout, taking no pleasure in her downfall. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting his daughter and ensuring justice was served. Back home, life slowly returned to normal. John bought Lily a new wheelchair and a soft purple blanket, her favorite color. Her smile gradually returned, brighter than before. The neighborhood transformed, too. Without Karen's oppressive rules, people relaxed. Kids started playing with Lily again, and neighbors visited regularly. One evening, Mrs. Carter brought cookies. Other neighbors helped paint the wheelchair ramp in bright, cheerful colors. Lily watched and clapped with delight. "You're my hero, Dad," Lily said one sunset evening on their porch. John pulled her close, his heart full. "You're mine too, sweetheart." Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was lighter now, freer. The Harpers had found their peace at last. John and Lily sat together, watching the neighborhood come alive again, kids laughing, neighbors waving, the heaviness finally lifted. They'd been through the fire together, and they'd come out stronger. That ramp at their door, now painted in rainbow colors by caring neighbors, stood as a symbol of their victory and the community's support. Lily's bright smile had returned, and John's heart was full. They were home. They were safe. And they were finally, truly happy. The end.